officially welcome everyone to session 9A, Carceral Continuum 5, Landscapes of Harm. I'm really delighted to be here. For those of you who don't know me, my name is Jennifer Turner and I'm the chair of the Carceral Geography Working Group. So it's an immense privilege to be here to hear papers at this wonderful fifth international conference for Carceral Geography. This session is super exciting. I chose to chair it on purpose, let's just say, so I'm happy to have the privilege. We've got 4 speakers in today's session, and we will hear each presentation followed by an opportunity for questions for each presenter in the chat. I'll introduce the presenters just in a short moment. To those of us who've already experienced this conference already online, you will have already heard some details about the Zoom etiquette, but just to say that everyone should be muted unless they're speaking. It's nice to see people on cameras. Feel free to be on or off camera as you wish. And if we can we save public chat in the chat function until after the presentations? Feel free to type your question and then press send when the person's finished speaking, because sometimes it can be disruptive to the person who's presenting. Without further ado, I think we can move forward onto our first presentation, which I'm really excited to hear. And I really warmly welcome Rachel Andrews, whose title is Repair, Place Remaking and Collective Action at the Unmarked Children's Grave at the Tuam Mother and Baby Home, County Galway in Ireland, 2014-2021. The floor is yours, Rachel. Please tell us all about your work.
Thanks, Jennifer. Okay, so I'm just going to share this. Okay, you can see my screen, okay?
Yes.
Yes, okay, perfect. So yeah, as you said, the title of my presentation is Repair, Collective Placemaking and Counter Memory at the Unmarked Children's Grave at the former Tuam Mother and Baby Home, County Galway, Ireland. Okay, so in May 2014, allegations that around 796 babies and young children had been buried in a disused sewage tank at the former Mother and Baby Home in Tuam, County Galway, made international headlines. The allegations were confirmed several years later, when a government-appointed commission of investigation to inquire into mother and baby homes in Ireland announced officially the discovery of the human remains. Since 2014, the Unmarked Grave at Tuam has also operated as a focal point for those who suffered in mother and baby homes in Ireland. The focus of this presentation is to consider how these survivors, along with the community in Tuam, as well as local artists, have sought to reclaim and make publicly visible the space of the Unmarked Grave at Tuam, a site that had, until recently, been all but erased from Ireland's collective memory. The presentation will focus particularly on a large vigil that was held at the Tuam site in August 2018, organised to coincide with the first papal visit to Ireland in almost 40 years. The paper draws on the contemporary scholarship of Loeffler, Carlson and John, Demos, Juncker and Till, and others involved in the work of place memory and counter memory. And my aim is to consider how the vigil, which involved a crowd of around 1,000 speaking aloud the names of the dead children, operated as a public act of counter-memorialisation in Irish society. Before continuing, however, I just want to give a short historical overview of the Unmarked Grave site in Tuam. So the Tuam Mother and Baby Home was operated by the Bon Secours Sisters from 1925 until 1961 when it closed. During that time, 2,219 mothers entered the home. The home was owned by Galway County Council, the authority responsible for local government in the area, and it paid the sisters a capitation fee for each woman and child in the home. It paid for external repairs to the building, as well as rates, water, rent, and insurance. It also paid the salaries of the chaplain, the medical officer, and the maternity nurse of the home. On average, women who gave birth in Tuam in the home remained in the home for a year, where they cared for their children and they worked as unpaid domestic servants. After this, they left the home almost always without their child, although they were expected to contribute financially to the child's upkeep. Some of the children were adopted, but many remained in the home until school-going age, after which they were, quote, boarded out in foster homes. The home closed in August 1961, and a decade later, Galway County Council demolished it, and they built a housing estate on the 7 acres where the home had stood. As with the other mother and baby homes in Ireland, the home had a high rate of infant and child mortality. Of the 3,349 children who were resident in the home between 1925 and 1961, 978 of them died, and the majority of these, almost 800, died in the home itself. Neither the Bonsecourt sisters nor Galway County Council kept a register of these children's burial locations, and for half a century, no one appears to have thought to inquire where the children were buried. Instead, from the 1970s, a local couple kept an informal memorial garden in the area in a walled off space that had previously formed part of the home. And that's just a picture of the garden there. And it wasn't until 2014, following research carried out by Tuam native Catherine Corliss, that speculation began as to whether the Bonsecourt sisters had in fact converted a disused sewage tank underneath the grotto area into a burial vault and buried the children there. And as I said, this speculation was confirmed a few years later by after test excavations at the site. And just a note about visibility and invisibility at the site. Until recently, Irish society did not speak openly of unmarried mothers and their children. In general, women who went into the Tuam home did not receive any visitors. They were delivered to the home in the dead of night, often under cover of darkness, and in official documentation until recently, again, they were referred to as offenders. Once they were in the home, women were given a house name, so their real identity couldn't be determined, and they were given a uniform to wear rather than their own clothes. The home itself was surrounded with 8-foot high walls, and it was located outside the boundary of the town of Tuam, keeping women and their children separate from the wider community. And then, as noted, after the Tuam home closed, it was demolished by the local authority and replaced by a housing estate and adjoining playground. And that's a picture of the playground there. And there was no official marker put down. So effectively, the existence was almost wiped. So as I said, my argument is sorry, where am I now? I've lost it. Yeah. My argument is to say that the survivors, along with the artists and members of the community, have engaged in a communal reclaiming of traumatic space, particularly through the engagement of the vigil at Tuam. These are just some other artistic activities that have taken place recently, where the names of the babies were written on sheets and placed on the outskirts or surrounding the space of the burial space at Tuam. But to move on to the vigil at Tuam. So the vigil at Tuam, as I said, was held on the 26th of August 2018 to coincide with the first papal visit to Ireland in nearly 40 years. It began in the late afternoon when around 1,000 people assembled at the Tuam Town Hall to walk 30-minute route to the former site of the mother and baby home. The crowd walked in silence to the site, passing teddy bears and other cuddly toys that had been tied to gates and posts along the route. Upon arrival, a special sculpture in the shape of a baptismal font was placed at the site, alongside candles in memory of those who died in the home. There were baby shoes placed on the site, and another group held placards with the names of 10 women who had died at the Tuam mother and baby home. Small cream-coloured cards with the names of the babies and their ages were handed around the crowd, and at 3 p.m., at exactly the same time as Pope Francis was began leading mass at the Phoenix Park, the crowd began to call aloud the children's names, one after another, one on top of each other in a kind of a chorus. And I'm just going to try and bring up the link to, oh yeah, here it is, to a little video just, oh, okay, one sec, sorry. I'm not very good at this. Can you still see my screen? Can you see the Irish Times?
Yes, we can.
Yeah. Okay. Great. Hopefully it'll come up. No, sorry. Very slow internet. Oh, finally.
Today, we're going to read the babies' names. We've no speeches, we've no prayers. The babies' names speak for themselves. And I'm going to start with my sister, Margaret Mary O'Connor, died aged 6 months.
Gerald Cunningham, 11 months.
Kathleen Fine, 3 years. 7 months.
Brandon McGreen, 2 months.
Patrick Joseph Coleman, 1 month. Annie Coyne, 3 months.
3 months.
Teresa Kenneth, 3 months.
Okay, now try and get back to my screen. Oh, wherever it is. Oh, here it is. Now you can see that again. Yes, you can. Okay, sorry. So, what does the collective action of the Tuam Vigil, what does it mean for spatial justice at the unmarked grave in Tuam? Demos defines counter-memory as, quote, a practice of memory formation that is social and political, and which runs counter to the, quote, official histories of government, mainstream mass media, and society of the spectacle. The production of counter-memories, therefore, is a key element in the positive transformation of social and political reality in the future. I contend that the vigil offered an opportunity for survivors and local community to come together and publicly mark the space of the gravesite in such a way as to allow them to, quote, make contact with their loss, contain unwanted presences, or confront past injustices. Crucially, the public collective action also offered an opportunity for the creation of collective counter-memory. And as Demos also has it, art is also a critical space for the production of counter-memories, offering as it does a site where experimental collective memory can be generated, performed and archived. It's a consideration that has also been highlighted by Hulsher and Alderman during their discussion of the role of performance and performativity as a mode of memorialization in the landscape. And they have noted that, quote, performances like rituals, festivals, pageants, public dramas, and civic ceremonies serve as a chief way in which societies remember. So as I briefly alluded to, there have been other art and community events at Tuam site since 2018, such as the work of the artist Erin Darcy, and I showed you the white sheets sewn to the fence at the Tuam Mother and Baby Home with the names of the babies written on them. It is my contention that events such as this, and particularly, of course, the vigil at the Tuam gravesite, straddle the boundaries of a collective community event and performative art. In the act of speaking aloud the names of the babies and children at the unmarked gravesite, the vigil operated as both a literal and metaphorical counterpoint to the official history of Ireland's church and state, which had rendered the women and children of the mother and baby homes invisible in life and in death. The group attending the vigil performed a collective relearning and remembering in Irish society, rendering visible what had for so long been concealed and creating a space for the delivery of spatial and social justice. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Rachel.
Sharing?
That would be great. Thank you very much. And then we can engage with you. Thank you so much for being so timely as well. That's the best chairs, chairs situation, which means I can open the floor. Do I have anyone who'd like to ask a question? Feel free to raise your virtual or actual hand or add anything to the chat. Lauren, feel free.
Hi, Rachel. That was really interesting, though obviously really tragic. I was just interested in, so you spoke the kind of idea of counter memory as running counter to the kind of official and state histories of what has happened. I was interested, I suppose, in what I assume there's been a bit of a reckoning with the official narrative of what happened as well more recently. And I was just wondering what the official or state kind of narrative is now on the homes or on this or on Tuam.
Yeah, that is a very good question. I suppose, I think the main narrative, despite the reckoning, remains to some extent that it is a dark part of our history rather than a sort of an ongoing and present situation. And I suppose those events such as the vigil at Tuam and other events that have taken place and continue to take place since are attempting to sort of chip away at that narrative. But I think that they remain to some extent on the fringes, to some extent. They have obviously much greater power in Irish society than they used to. Nonetheless, I don't think it has managed to it has managed to sort of take the, become part of our present. Now we are a contemporary, whatever, modern society, and all of that was in the past, but it really isn't in the past when you consider, particularly, as many people point out, like the way that we particularly have our particular system of dealing with asylum seekers, for example, is almost an exact replica of what happened with the mother and baby homes, in that they are separated out from society, to some extent hidden from society. And we have had instances where people in that community have died, and there isn't necessarily, we don't exactly know where they are buried, So that's what I would suggest is still the dominant narrative, even though, as I say, it is being sort of pushed at.
Thanks, Richard. Thanks, Lauren, for the great question. Joe, did I see a small hand creep in?
Yeah, a little hand came up there. I was just fascinating talk. Thank you so much for the expression of it. I was wondering if you could say a little bit more about the background of these homes. They said because it sounds like there's a punitive logic, but also like this justification of care. And I was wondering if you could say a little bit more about that sort of background of the homes.
Yeah, so the homes are, I suppose, they're like when we go back to how they came about, they're a follow on from the colonial. So they they were workhouses when until say 1921 or whatever, when Ireland became a free state. So they were set up as workhouses at some point during British rule of Ireland, probably around the time of the famine, and from then on. And then when the Irish Free State sort of came into being, it was a very, I suppose, fragile, vulnerable state, and a lot of and not a very wealthy state, and a lot of those buildings were in place. So the buildings were in place. The Irish state wasn't particularly wealthy. And I suppose the Irish state also sought to distinguish itself from Britain, particularly as we went on into the 1930s, by actually becoming, by creating a narrative of itself as a very sort of Catholic, traditional, they probably wouldn't have used the word conservative, but that is how we distinguish ourselves from Britain, by traditional family values, all of that stuff. So you had the wish to distinguish yourself from Britain by becoming a very sort of Catholic country. So as a result, then the church is given a lot of power. Now the church already had quite a lot of power since around the time of the famine. So it had that role in society, and that role was consolidated then once the Free State came into being. And then as well, the fact that it wasn't a particularly wealthy country. So you had all of those issues coming together. So the church was given the role, it handed the role really of health, education, etc., etc. But it turned from, I suppose, this idea of care, which is what they said it was, it became much more punitive, because I suppose, again, this whole idea of presenting ourselves to the world as the very best possible idea of being Irish, and that was to become, you know, the best citizens that we could possibly be, which we were married, we were blah blah blah, and all of these outsiders could not possibly you know, play a role. So a lot to do with insecurity, post-colonialism, etc., etc. I don't know, does that answer your question a bit?
Thanks, Jo. So, thanks, Rachel. Got time for one quick question. But I have one in my bag of questions, if I can take the privilege, maybe just a short one. And because you use visibility, you know, and the visibility of collective action, as sort of spatial justice, but then you but also then we also heard the significance of naming, and there's something specific about the names, and also then the voicing of that. So I wondered if there's more than just visibility going on here, because that's very one sensory in a sense, and there are more than that. So I don't know if you had other thoughts on multi-sensory.
Yeah. That is interesting. That's a good point, actually. Yeah, and I mean, it is, to some extent, it is multi-sensory. This idea to reclaim the space. So you've had the vigil where you had the names said into the public sphere. There have been, I'm trying to think what else. There have been, I suppose, paper flowers have been created and placed at the grave site. There have been, so the Magdalene women had, until the time of COVID, there had been a sort of flowers from Magdalene, again, a public sort of vigil that took place all over the country. So I suppose it is a very good point, actually, that it is sort of ways of making what was sort of hidden become, again, you know, take up space, I suppose, in many different ways of taking up space. And the names are very important because so many of these people ended up in unmarked grave sites. These are women and their children who haven't really been named. And just interestingly, in about 1996, I think it was, they placed a plaque, sort of a memorial to Magdalene women in the park in St. Stephen's Green, which is the public park in Dublin. And that came about as a result of agitation, but the plaque itself is, again, another unnamed plaque. So it says, to the Magdalene women and their children who worked in the homes, etc., etc., but they're not named. And so I suppose that has been one of the big things that has been, that the advocates have been pushing for, is to get people's names out there. So I think that didn't really answer your question, Jennifer, but I think it was more of a comment.
I think it was more of a comment, maybe another theoretical angle.
Very good point. Yeah.
Thank you so much, Rachel. We'll stop there in the interest of time. I really, it's a bit strange to say, I really enjoyed such a powerful and sad narrative, but thank you for that. We'll move on, if we're able to. We'll move on to Oliver Wilson-Nunn, who has a very interesting topic for us today: remediating the geographies of justice and modernity in mid-century Argentinian prison films. This is a new one for me, Oliver, so the floor is yours, and please do tell us all about it.
Great, thank you. So thank you everyone for coming. Thank you, Jennifer, and thank you to the organisers as well for putting together such an interesting programme and accommodating people across different time zones. So as
may I ask,
Jennifer said,
sorry to interrupt you, could you make your slides big for us? Thank you.
Oh yeah, yeah.
Apologies for interruption.
I'll
leave you in peace. Thank you.
Thank you. So yeah, the title of my presentation today is Remediating the Geographies of Justice and Modernity in Mid-20th Century Argentine Prison Films. And this is building on some of the ideas from the second chapter of my PhD thesis, in which I'm looking at the relationships between cinema and criminal justice, lots of it focused in Argentina. And the aim is to, in this specific chapter, is to mobilize a spatial framework to show how cinema about imprisonment made during the governments of Juan Domingo Perón both represents and participates in the increased sort of porosity of carceral and non-carceral space in the geographies of mid-century urban modernity. So I'm going to start by giving some context about the carceral, political and cinematic landscape of 1940s and 1950s Argentina, which I imagine will be quite alien to most people, with the aim of highlighting why I think a spatial approach is important. Then secondly, building on my argument that moving images not only represent but participate in the criminal justice system, I explore how new forms of film production and spectatorship, both inside and outside prison, engaged with spatial discourses of prison reform at the time. And then I'm going to move on to a brief, closer reading of the 1948 film Apenas un delincuente, or Hardly a Criminal, focusing on how the film stages the influence of the prison on the circulation of crime, capital, and emotion in the city. And then I'm going to end with a few brief remarks about where I see my analysis fitting in with some broader methodological debates. So the context that I'm engaging with is the first two presidencies of Juan Domingo Perón from 1946 to 1955. And he's a figure whose legacy still continues to structure and in many ways divide Argentine politics today. Alongside his wife Evita, who we see here, Peronism mobilized the concept of social justice to incorporate new social identities into Argentine politics, including women who were first allowed to vote in 1947, and crucial to thinking about the changing social geographies of the country, people from the country's interior who migrated to the capital city, Buenos Aires. And these were people whose appearance and customs often jarred with the more Eurocentric, whiter identity of the capital city. So we have a photo on the right here, which is a very famous image that captured the wave of supposedly darker skinned people from across the country who came to support Perón, and this wave of immigration provoked waves of racist and classist anger. So one important critique of first Peronism has been regarding its belief in a universally expansive state to mediate every single type of social problem. So alongside an increased role in the distribution of wealth, so what Dr. would call the sort of state's left hand, we also see a huge investment in police, and in some ways, and especially for political opponents, the prisons, that's to say sort of the state's right hand. Now, a crucial aspect of this reformulated vision of the role of the state was what scholars have called an ambitious humanist project of prison reform. So Perón appointed his ally Roberto Pettinato, who we see in the left image, as head of his prison service. Now, Argentine historian Lila Gaimari has shown how the material reforms introduced by Pettinato, such as the closure of the fear-inspiring Ushuaia prison in the icy south of Argentina that we see on the right, and the banning of the dehumanizing striped uniforms that we see on the left, were consistently framed within a historical logic of rupture with the past. So against an unjust, immobile carceral past, the time had come to provide humane, rehabilitative support to the overwhelmingly working class population of the prisons, aligned with the base of Perón's main civil support. Crucially, the idea of visibilizing prisons, albeit with the obvious caveat of being selective about what is visibilized, was key to these new carceral policies. be it in the case of photography, as studied by historian Jeremia Silva, or cinema, both propagandistic documentaries and fictional films that, in theory, lacked official association with the government. But as film historian Clara Grieger shows, even these films were deeply embedded within a broader temporal logic, which we might term sort of temporal politics of Peronist modernity, whereby all past times were worse. This could happen, for example, by showing dramatic prison reform within the real time of a film, or having a cautionary note at the beginning of the film that real life prisons of the present obviously nothing like what the viewer is about to see in a pre-Peronist past. So, while these ideas are crucial to understanding the social, cultural, and political significance of incarceration in mid-century Argentina, my aim here is to highlight more the sort of spatio-temporal politics of modernity, focusing on the ways in which prisons and their relationship to visual culture were not only about changing relationships between past and present, but new spatial relationships between the city, the prison, the movie theatres, the home, the neighbourhood, the workplace. And these relationships both hint at possibilities for change at the same time as they point to the role of prison in perpetuating socioeconomic inequalities. In this sense, I'm thinking alongside geographer Sarah Radcliffe's argument that, I quote, "Modernity's landscape of power is a spatial disposition, a story about the location of objects, boundaries, and subjects, and their interrelationships across space." Now, following Foucault, the classic spatial reconfiguration of carceral modernity is understood as a sort of move away from the visible public spectacle to the distant, secretive treatment in prisons. Within Peronism, however, and here the idea of visibility comes back importantly, there's a constant aim to reduce the sort of socio-spatial distance between the polis, the urban, political, and cultural community, and prisons, perhaps most emblematically expressed in Pettinato's spatial metaphor, "May the revolution reach the prisons." So the state envisaged cinema as a crucial means of diminishing this distance, producing an exaggerated belief in what film theorist Giuliana Bruno has termed the sightseeing qualities of cinema, whereby cinema's obsession with modern urban architectural forms, especially in the first half of the 20th century, produced spectators as sort of tourists who would marvel at impressive modern sites of transit, for example, the trains, the trams, etc. Importantly, Peronism was the time which saw the emergence of location shooting in real prisons in Argentina, notably the grandiose Penitenciaria Nacional in Buenos Aires, which we see in these two stills here, which, built in the 1880s, had long been used as a symbol to boast Argentine modernity abroad. International politicians and criminologists were frequently invited as tourists, including, for example, the daughter of Cesare Lombroso, etc. So, unlike these elite tourists, however, the spectators of popular Argentine cinema were the working and lower middle classes. Indeed, the upper middle and the upper classes either preferred foreign cinema or just didn't like the films at all. And we can thus think of location shooting in real prisons as this kind of awkward, ambivalent practice that, on one hand, belies the often close relationship between the film industry and the prison service in Argentina, just in the sort of very simple terms of requiring the permission to shoot in these spaces, but also a kind of democratization of the problematic, but perhaps important practice of prison tourism, sort of transporting people to spaces that were widely inaccessible and encouraging them to become more aware about incarceration, even if this was often done in selective ways, or ways that would provoke sort of paternalist compassion rather than sort of collaborative desires for change. It was not only film spectatorship outside prison, however, that was important for the reformist logics of Peronism, but also exhibiting films inside prisons, which chimes with what North American scholars Heidi Wasson and Charles Ackland term useful cinema, namely the instrumentalization of film in non-theatrical spaces in order to satisfy organizational demands and objectives. So showing films inside prison had a partly disciplinary function, made explicit in the 1952 prison film Disgraced, in which one of the protagonists in the newly reformed Peronist prison notes that there are now weekly film screenings for those with good behavior, suggesting a sort of territorializing effect of cinema to rein in the supposedly unruly behavior of imprisoned people. Beyond the use of film as a reward, the head of prisons, Pettinato, wrote in a state-published criminological journal about the benefits of screening, I quote, "Both fiction films that contribute to moral education and creating optimism for life, and also documentaries aimed at keeping the inmate informed and connected to outside social changes that he must follow to facilitate his social readaptation." And here we have an image I found in an archive in Argentina in the prison museum, which shows a group of prisoners watching a football match as part of a newsreel. So there is this recurring idea, but now from a slightly different perspective, that watching moving images can move people through ideas and emotion, think about the idea of motion, across prison walls, at once romanticizing the possibilities of culture inside prison, but also pointing us towards the porosity of ideas, people, money, objects, and affects that we now know to exist between inside and out, in large part thanks to the advances in, for example, carceral geography. So I'm going to end now with some filmic analysis that captures some of the interests and anxieties about bringing prison and wider society closer together. I'm going to look at Hugo Fregonese's 1948 noir-inflected crime film, Hardly a Criminal, which notably was the first Argentine film to be shot fully outside of the studios, in location in the busy streets of the capital city and its landmark prison, the Penitenciaría Nacional. So to sum up some of the key parts of the plot very briefly, office worker José Morán, fed up with his tedious office job, his meager salary and rising debts, decides to defraud his company for 500,000 pesos and hide it after he learns that fraud bears a maximum 6-year sentence, regardless of the amount that's stolen. Most obviously, Morán exchanges time for money, 6 years for unlimited riches. But as I show in other parts of this chapter, it's also sort of a resistance against, but also a logic deeply embedded within the sort of spatio-economic logics of capitalist modernity, making an exchange between the homogeneous spaces of the workplace, the house, and the prison. But rather than focusing on the crime, I want to focus on the effects of the prison, paying close attention to abolitionist geographer Ruth Wilson Gilmore's famous argument that, I quote, "Prison is not a building over there, but a set of relationships that undermine rather than stabilize everyday lives everywhere." So Morán's brother, for example, laments that, in his words, "I can no longer get any further than the front door. The police check the house with any old excuse," reminding us to think of incarceration not only as a practice that extracts individuals from their private space into state space, but also an expansion of the state space at the expense of the private experience of other people as well. A comparable, interesting example is a memorable scene in which, with dramatic minor music, Morán's mother, brother, and fiancé, as we see here, walk through their neighborhood in a sort of corridor of shame as their neighbors glare at them. This is particularly interesting thinking about the specific socio-spatial formation of the Buenos Aires neighborhood, which arose in the 1920s and 30s, constructed in direct opposition, supposedly, to the social ills of modernity in the city center. Here, Morán's office crime and his imprisonment in what was understood as a markedly modern institution make the family's bodies literally turn away from their neighborhood and, at a more important scale, force them to stay in their home, kind of dramatizing both the origins and the changing coordinates of a very specific socio-spatial formation.
About 2 minutes.
Lastly, I want to briefly draw on the example of the escape in the film, which Morán, alongside some anarchists, carries out by stealing the truck used to bring in the materials that the incarcerated men work with in the prison's printing press as part of their rehabilitative labor. The scene dramatizes one of the gaps in the supposed closed fortress of discipline, a gap that is produced by its own moral and economic mission of reforming men through cheap labor. And this same project allows the men to speed off in the car and recover their lost riches. So if Peronist discourse on prison reform emphasized the benefits of bringing prisons closer to everyday life, this film dwells on, in sort of both a nervous and subversive way, the literally anarchic slippages that the prison can create in this instance. So to finish off with, I just want to briefly situate the role of my analysis within some broader debates. Methodologically, one of my key aims is to move beyond a common practice whereby both criminologists and film scholars treat the analysis of prison films as a sort of spot the difference between prison realities and prison images. We now know very well they're not the same, and sort of to think about it in terms of positionality, the most insightful studies of this kind undoubtedly continue to come from people who have lived the experience of incarceration. In this sense, I'm also more interested in the performative meaning making of images, combined with an attentiveness to the social and economic realities of production, exhibition, and reception. I think it's only by taking all these elements into account that we can move towards a better understanding of the role of moving images in both the imagined and material geographies that distance and bring together incarcerated and non-incarcerated people. Great.
Thank you so much, Oliver. Virtual round of applause from everyone there. And may I say, such a lyrical presentation. I don't think this is the right word, but I was very captivated by what you were saying. So I really enjoyed it. Any questions directly for Oliver? Right, well, I'm going to jump in, Oliver, if I may, because I really found this a really interesting paper, genuinely. And you mentioned two things that piqued my interest as someone who was really interested in the prison boundary and also the mobilities surrounded with our carceral landscapes. Can you tell me a little bit more about your wider project, and do you engage with carceral geographies, boundary literature, or mobilities literature? Because I would love to know more about your work.
Yes. So for example, I've done previous projects about kind of the interstices between prison education projects and people who go in as kind of visitors and people who go in to make films. And a key part of that is to engage with kind of the areas around the prison as sort of how these people interact with the families of people who are in prison, how these people interact, sort of go on to tell other people who have no physical experience of prison about their work in these spaces. And sort of there's an increasing body of literature in the Argentine context about this kind of idea of the long shadow of imprisonment, both sort of in the academic literature, but also kind of culturally in a way which I think is not so present in lots of other contexts that I'm aware of. So for example, there are multiple books and documentaries coming out about people who go the experience of sort of queuing up in lines outside imprisonment, which is outside prisons, which is also becoming so important with the kind of very geographical changes to the prison landscape in Argentina, as prisons are being increasingly moved out of the cities into the boundaries. For example, in Buenos Aires, there's only one prison left in the actual capital city itself. So yeah, lots of those things come together. And yeah, to try to think about how, I guess the key thing is to think about how people outside prison, given my own experiences as someone who's worked in prisons but hasn't been imprisoned, how we engage with those spaces and not just thinking about the people inside prison.
Yeah, thanks for that. No, carceral boundary, prison boundary literature would definitely speak to some of the things that you're doing. But I also think there would be a really nice opportunity for a really nice paper about carceral mobilities based on your case study. So,
sounds really good.
Selfishly, write that, please.
Yes,
that would be great.
Great, thank you.
Anyone else intrigued by Oliver's work? Sarah, please do.
Thanks for that presentation, Oliver. It was really interesting. And I think the part that really grabbed me the most is when you're talking about the temporal politics of it. I was just curious, from your work so far, if you have sort of an opinion on whether or not the goal to rupture with the past was achieved, or was partially, like, how successful was that? Because obviously, like, that is like politically really important if you can separate yourself out. So I'm just curious about that.
Yeah, it's a great question. And it's one that the sort of historian Lila Maddie has worked on quite a bit. And sort of to think about it in material terms with this period of first parallelism, there was, in some senses, like an actual rupture. I mean, there were lots of new experiences. For example, the possibility of marital or conjugal visits was a big change. And it was sort of embedded within broader Peronist politics about sexuality, but also thinking about new sort of the general welfare was improved in certain prisons, and that's kind of the key part. The kind of the sort of temporal logic of it was very geographically limited, and so most of the most striking changes happened in this particular prison in the capital city, which was used as kind of the poster, the emblem for all that was good, whereas most prisons in rural areas and across the country stayed exactly the same. And that actually comes through in some sort of almost unwittingly in some sort of supposedly propagandistic films at the time, where they kind of pass from a regional prison, which is shown to be sort of violent, decaying, and then they say, oh, but this person has had the luck of being imprisoned. That's literally the way they use the word, like they're fortunate enough to be imprisoned in the capital city. And sort of in that sense, they're both pointing to the sort of rupture that they're carrying out, but also to the sort of geographical limits of a temporal logic of reform. So yeah, that's a really important issue. Thank you for the question.
That's so fascinating. Thank you.
Thanks.
Thank you so much, Sarah. Thank you so much, Oliver. If I may, I'll conclude here with Oliver, and if there are burning questions, please do add them to the chat or anything later on, and I'm sure Oliver would appreciate your further feedback. Begrudgingly, I move on, not begrudgingly because I don't want to hear the next person, but because, you know, time in all these scenarios. I would like to take us to Lauren Cape-Davenhill, who is going to tell us about state surveillance, state support, and alternatives to detention in the UK. Lauren, the floor is yours.
Great, thanks very much. Can people see the slides okay?
If you could make them, yeah, that's great. Thank you so much.
Brilliant. So hi, I'm Lauren from the University of Leeds in the UK, and I'll be presenting today on state surveillance, state support, alternatives to detention in the UK, which is drawing on my PhD research, which is being carried out in collaboration with the Gatwick Detainee Welfare Group, which is a charity providing emotional and practical support to people in detention by Gatwick Airport in the south of England. I guess I just say as well, early ideas for this project had support from Jen, which I was really grateful for, along with others. So just wanted to say that something was really helpful at the early stages. So yeah, my kind of broader PhD is exploring people's experiences of facing deportation after contact with the criminal justice system. So I'm interested in people's trajectories and experiences across different sites of incarceration, because in the UK, if people are facing deportation after the contact with the criminal justice system, it normally means they've spent time in prison, often time in immigration detention, and also often on some kind of community-based supervision for immigration purposes, or alternatives to detention. And I guess my focus today is the alternatives to detention side. So I've spoken to people about trajectories across these different carceral sites, but I'll focus today on alternatives to detention as a form of confinement in the community. I guess I thought I'd just kick off by sharing a call I had from a research participant. So it was a qualitative study. I interviewed 24 people with experience of facing deportation. And a participant called very distressed. It's someone who's got chronic health issues. So he's had cancer, functionally disabled, very limited mobility, and he was due to have an MRI scan. But when he got there, he was told by the consultant that he wasn't able to proceed with the scan due to his ankle tag. So this individual had been put on an ankle tag, a form of electronic monitoring, as a form of alternative to detention, so as a form of supervision for immigration purposes in the community. And because ankle tags are metal, it means you can't go into an MRI scanner with them, and you obviously can't take them off. So I guess just given I was thinking about this conference when I had this phone call, it felt like a very literal illustration that there is a relationship between community-based forms of supervision and state care. In this instance, this gentleman having an ankle tag was literally a physical barrier to him accessing state care. But I guess the relationship between alternatives to detention and state support feels interesting and not 100% straightforward, which I'll try and explore towards the end of this paper. But just very briefly, for people who aren't familiar with the term, what are alternatives to detention? It's a category of practices used by governments to manage asylum seekers or irregular migrants in the community, as opposed to in some form of physical site of incarceration. So in the UK, we used immigration detention for people who do not have leave to remain in the UK, who the government is trying to remove. And the idea of alternatives to detention is that these people are somehow managed and supervised in the community, as opposed to being incarcerated in detention. They generally involve some kind of restrictions on movement or liberty and are often drawn from community sanctions and supervision in the criminal justice system. So for example, ankle tags, electronic monitoring, very directly drawn from the use of ankle tagging in the criminal justice system as a sanction or as a probation supervision technique. In the UK, we have a range of alternatives to detention in use, and people are often subjected, almost always subjected, in fact, to more than one. I'm going to focus today on primarily on reporting restrictions, electronic monitoring, and accommodation restrictions, because they felt most relevant, particularly in connection with ideas of state supports and care or non-care. So reporting involves people having to go and sign on with the Home Office, either at a reporting office or a police station, so kind of physically going. People might have to go weekly or monthly or fortnightly. So reporting of different frequency. There's been some movement towards telephone and digital forms of reporting, especially during COVID, but at the moment it's still primarily, it's moved back and is still primarily in person. And as of 2017, so slightly out of date figures, but it was about 80,000 people a year who were reporting for immigration purposes in the UK, so relatively high numbers. Electronic monitoring, as mentioned, this is ankle tags. So powers for electronic monitoring for immigration purposes have been in place since 2014. And last year, there was a transition over to GPS tagging in the immigration system. So in the past, it was radio frequency. Now it's GPS. So that means that people's location can be monitored 24 hours a day when they're on tag, which is quite a big change. Also change in the last few years has been that anyone who has had contact with the criminal justice system, which has been the case for all of my research participants, the Secretary of State is obliged to put people on tag if they're getting released from detention, unless there's a good reason not to. So there's been this kind of expansion in the automatic use of tagging for certain groups, unless there's a reason not to, as opposed to it being you tag if there's a positive reason to. And as of March this year, about 1,700 people a year are being monitored in the UK for immigration purposes using electronic monitoring. And yeah, so as is common, and in my sample, most people were subject to multiple forms of these restrictions. So restrictions on work and residence and studying apply to pretty much everybody on any form of alternative to detention. People are not allowed to work. They have to live at a certain address and notify the Home Office of that address. And access to education and right to education is limited. And then over half of the people I spoke with both had a regular reporting requirement and were on an ankle tag. So people being subject to kind of a constellation of these forms of control together. It's not just one thing in isolation. So I'm just going to very briefly discuss this is very emergent. I only finished my data collection about 2 weeks ago. So these are very preliminary kind of initial thoughts around alternatives to detention as a form of confinement. And again, I was trying to think about these techniques kind of not necessarily in isolation, but cumulatively as well. So first of all, what came through really strongly was the level to which these requirements really structure people's everyday routine and their mobility. So with reporting, people kind of organizing their time, okay, I've got to go on a Monday and a Wednesday. So people's kind of week being structured around getting to these reporting appointments. And similarly with tags, people organizing their days around charging the tag, because you have to keep the tag charged. And if you don't, it counts as a breach of your conditions. And there've been various tech issues supported that normally people were saying, it's normally seemed to be about 2 hours that they need to charge, but some people were saying it was really variable, the amount of charging time. So people having to wait inside you know, and having to kind of organize their day around letting their tags charge. And in terms of mobility, there was something people, you know, because when you're charging, you're physically tethered to a wall because the tag is attached to your ankle. So there's something, even though this is obviously not, you're not in prison, but you are kind of voluntarily having to physically attach yourself to a wall in order to charge your ankle tag. So something about there's still a kind of physical tethering there, even though it's something that you have some control over when you're doing it and where. And I guess around this, the very high levels of self-discipline. So people are making these routines for themselves. And I think because with people of, the consequences of breaching these conditions are potentially being redetained, and alongside with that being deported, that provides an extremely strong motivator for people to organize themselves to comply. So things like people, you know, if there were technical issues with the tag, or if they couldn't go to a reporting appointment because they were ill, people reporting being very proactive about trying to notify the Home Office because of that fear of the consequences if they didn't. Secondly, alternatives to detention as a form of confinement are very, very intimate. So in the tagging particularly, it's a form of confinement that's literally acting upon your own body. And people really spoke, as is echoed in other literature, kind of Carolina Bow and others, the physical discomfort, the vibrations, people talking about having physical marks on their ankles, physical, you know, visible signs from the tags rubbing. And also the ways in which this can intrude on other kind of relationships and social activities in your life. So with tagging, people being very aware of the social stigma around, you know, not wanting their tag to be visible, which was then constraining things like people doing exercise, especially. A lot of people spoke about, I like football, but I feel uncomfortable having this massive thing on my ankle. I want to take my son swimming, but I don't want him to ask questions. And similarly with reporting requirements, people, these are sometimes accompanied by curfews also, so having to be at your address at certain times, so people feeling unable to kind of commit to social activities or voluntary activities because of being worried about having to get back in time for their curfew or being able to make their reporting appointment. And then finally, and something that in some ways I'm particularly interested in because of the previous work I've done non-academically around the issue of immigration detention in the UK, because we don't have a time limit on the use of immigration detention. That's something that's really highlighted, that, you know, we have indefinite detention in the UK as compared to prison, which has a time limit. And actually the same is also true with alternatives to detention. So in community supervision and sanctions in the criminal justice system will almost always have a time limit on them. Their use in the immigration system doesn't. And my research found very consistently that people were spending much, much longer on some form of alternative to detention than they had either in prison or in detention. So a gentleman who I'm calling Paul had spent 7 months in prison of a 14-month sentence, 17 months in detention, which is a long time in detention, but then 11 years reporting monthly. And he said, you know, each year I just get a letter saying, carry on, that's it. So these very open-ended periods of time that people are on these forms of confinement with no provision for limitation. And then I guess just kind of briefly connecting with this idea of state support. So just in terms of people who are on some form of alternative detention, in the UK, they're used for people who don't have regular immigration status. So it's people who are either waiting for a decision or have had decision refused. And what that means is that people are not allowed to work and they don't have recourse to public funds. So access to any forms of benefits are very limited. But so you're in conditions where people are very often destitute or struggling financially. But you do need a level of financial solvency to be able to comply with alternatives to detention. So with reporting, people very often highlight transport costs, which can be prohibitive because they've kind of rationalized reporting centres. So they're not, there used to be more of them, and now people tend to have to travel longer distances because they've closed some of the local ones. So people sometimes travelling, maybe 2 hours each way, sometimes spending 20 or 30 pounds a week on travel costs to get to reporting appointments. And with
2 minutes, Lauren, thank you.
Yeah, great. And with people who are on, even if people do have access to state support, it would be a maximum of £37 a week. So people's almost entire benefits going just on getting trains to reporting appointments. And with tagging, you need to be able to charge your tag. And there's issues around homelessness and access to electricity. So kind of someone highlighting the fact that he's kind of sofa surfing with a friend, but this friend has said, I'm really sorry, energy costs are so high at the moment that you can't charge your tag in my house. So I think, and with accommodation restrictions, having to reside at a particular address as a condition of your living in the community, you have to have access to an address. So I guess the concern here is that alternatives to detention without some kind of state support is setting people up to fail. People are living in the community, unable to support themselves, unable to access benefits, but with conditions that require some money to be able to comply with them. And I guess this is not, the Home Office does recognise this, so there is some provision for accommodation and for travel expenses for reporting, with explicit acknowledgement in the guidance that we recognise that without some form of state support, people might not be able to comply with these conditions. So this is recognised, but the provision is in exceptional circumstances only. So although there's a recognition that people might need these, and the circumstances where people might need support to comply are certainly not exceptional. In reality, it's there's quite an onerous set of barriers to be able to access any kind of support. And just highlighting very briefly, the implications of non-compliance are not only detention, but there is the provision for prosecution. So it's very rarely used in practice, primarily, I think, due to Home Office capacity to chase, no one's got capacity to follow up prosecutions at the moment. But there is legally a risk that you could get prosecuted for failing to comply with your bail conditions, as well as it counting against you in future applications. So it doesn't look good if you've breached your conditions, and that can count against you in the future. So just winding up now, I guess the main takeaway for me at this point is that alternatives to detention require a minimal level of support to enable to compliance, and otherwise they're setting people up to fail. And I do feel like there's interesting connections with the crimmigration literature here, because there's been a lot of discussion about whether community sanctions and supervision in the criminal justice system divert people away from prison or serve as a pipeline into prison, because actually loads of people get sent to prison because of probation breaches, for example. And I guess I'm interested in what, if any, other parallels in the immigration system. Are these sanctions diverting people away from detention, or are they just broadening the number of people subject to some form of supervision? I suspect it's the latter. And then clear connections with the carceral geography literature in terms of, I'm hoping to develop my kind of understanding of alternatives to detention as a form of confinement in the community. And yeah, I think both from an academic, but also particularly from an advocacy point of view, because there's been a lot of campaigning against indefinite detention in the UK, but I do think more attention needs to be paid to the indefinite nature of the alternatives as well, which is not something that's been particularly highlighted, certainly that I've seen. And so I'm hoping that that's something that this work can contribute to. Thanks very much.
Thank you very much, Lauren. Very much appreciated there. Really powerful and again problematic narratives, and also some interesting parallels with the previous presentation in relation to, mobilities thinking and things there. A question, anyone got a question for Lauren? Ella, that was a hand up straight away.
Hi, sorry, Mark, I've not got my earphones in, so I hope it's not too echoey. Hi, Lauren, I just want to say thank you for such a fascinating presentation. That was really, really interesting. I was literally all the way through that presentation, I was thinking, please be writing something on no recourse to public funds. And I was interested as to whether your participants had the no recourse to public funds immigration status, because people don't realise that that is something that is like a legal category in the UK, that you can sort of be entirely dependent on somebody that you migrate here with, or you can have sort of any access to any public services and education completely withheld. So basically my first initial question was going to be about that, but then you kind of addressed that, so that was fine. But how much have you had to kind of contextualise this part of the kind of detention and immigration system within a broader kind of hostile environment literature? Because I'm really interested in these ideas that a lot of the practices surrounding sort of immigration monitoring are actually trialled in sort of less carceral environments. So I don't know how to kind of, I don't know how to kind of make this leap, I suppose, but obviously you're probably doing this PhD as part of a university, but even, for example, international students at the university that you will be part of will undergo similar levels of reporting, having to report to immigration centres, having to check into lectures and have like GPS tracking and all those sorts of things. So have you thought about sort of other softer systems, I guess, in which these practices become sort of normalised in terms of detention, kind of maybe the sort of the less carceral phase within sort of, I guess, like broader society that then, I guess, as I say, it's kind of part of this broader hostile environment system, which is all encompassing and doesn't just kind of dovetail onto detention systems. Sorry, that's not much of a question. But yeah, kind of, I presume you've had to think about a lot of the literature on the hostile environment. And the last thing I was thinking as you kind of culminated at the end of that presentation was this idea of kind of the border as a carceral boundary and the idea of a moving boundary and sort of, literature on that idea. So just to make me think of so many different kind of contexts and examples. But yeah, really interested to hear what you've got to say about kind of, no recourse to public funds and state care, hostile environment literature, that sort of thing.
Thanks, Ella. I'll let Lauren, but I think there were 3 points. So maybe Lauren, pick your most important, most interesting one.
Yeah, really, really interesting set of questions, Ella, giving me food for thought. It's really interesting what you said about, have I, in terms of the kind of maybe softer in inverted commas, how that maybe kind of laid the groundwork for these. Because I guess if anything, I'd been thinking of it in completely the other direction, in that what I think has happened to an extent is almost the other way, in that the level to which quite extreme forms of carceral supervision are trialled and piloted on precarious migrants in ways that are then spread out to other groups. So, do you see what I mean? So stuff like with the tagging, it was initially just people with convictions in the immigration system. And now it's been piloted with the channel arrivals. And that's exactly what happened in the States. So initially, electronic monitoring for immigration purposes as an alternative to detention was only used for people living with conviction, and now they use it for everyone, which I'm kind of slightly concerned is where we're heading. And similarly, okay, we introduced tags, we've transitioned onto GPS tags, they've now got a facial recognition pilot where they're using kind of facial recognition watches. So these extreme forms of like digital carceralism, which I think my feeling is are getting like piloted on a group of people that literally nobody cares about at all. Because especially with the sample that I'm looking at, it's people at the intersection of both being precarious migrants and former and ex-offenders, so kind of demonized from like every single side, and these particularly extreme forms of community-based supervision being like piloted on this group, which I suspect might then trickle out into other areas, both in terms of other migrants, but also potentially into other areas of society. In terms of whether the other way around, it's interesting. I have to have a think about that. I guess in some ways, a lot of these electronic monitoring, in some ways the hostile environment, as we're talking about it as a policy landscape post 2010, most of this stuff predated. So, both detention reporting requirements, even provisions for tagging have been there since 2004. So the specificities of the hostile environment landscape, a lot of these forms of supervision kind of pre-existed that. But certainly in terms of the way in which the normalization of supervision and of community-based forms of supervision of the border being a thing that's mobile and in everyday life, and I guess alternatives to detention in particular, it's very much the border is like literally there in your bed while you sleep, while you're stuck to a wall on charge. But I think it's something I will do a bit more thinking about, because I have a really interesting question.
Thanks very much to both Ella and Lauren there. Lauren, I'm going to have to close the conversation on your paper, but keep those conversations going. We didn't even mention energy prices and how that affects disproportionately. I will have to regrettably move on, again, regrettably, but with hope and enjoyment, for our final presentation. Last but not least, welcoming Sarah Huque and Joe Anderson on behalf, I think, also of Rebecca Helman, to talk to us about the nice topic of prison as suicidescape to close our session, but a very important one. So I'll hand over to you both, if that's okay. The floor is yours.
Can you see that now?
Yes, and we're just waiting for it to go on to slideshow mode. Yes, lovely. Welcome.
Great, thank you. So I'm Sarah, and along with my colleague Joe, we're here representing the Suicide Cultures Project at the University of Edinburgh. We're both postdoc research fellows on that project. And our presentation today is entitled Prison as a Suicidescape at the Intersection of Hostile Environments and Suicide Discourses. So very relevant to the conversation we were just having. So a bit of background about the Suicide Cultures Project. So the full title is Suicide Cultures Reimagining Suicide Research. It's a multi-site, multi-method, qualitative and creative methodological study of suicide across different communities in Scotland. So we're considering how is suicide constructed in different communities across Scotland, and that includes how it's talked about, understood, complicated, and challenged. And we're specifically looking at the roles of space, place, and time in the social construction of suicide in different locations. And so why do we need to reimagine suicide research? A lot of the existing research relies on quantitative and statistical style methods, which tell us some of the information. But we're trying to expand that using qualitative and creative methods that can help us engage with different knowledges about suicide and challenge what we know from statistical and also from psychological, pathological methods. We're also considering different scales, particularly engaging at a very hyper-local level. And we're looking at the impact of place, emotion, and social experience and how that can enrich our work on suicide. So in this presentation, we're specifically drawing from our analysis of fatal accident inquiry reports of suicides in Scottish prisons. Our analysis focuses on the dominant discourses used in the FAIs to absolve the prison system of blame for suicides, as most FAIs return no finding of fault within the system. After we discuss these sort of dominant discourses that are used to justify those findings of no fault, we're going to present some alternative discourses, which emphasize the prison itself as a hostile environment that contributes to suicidality. These are also drawn from the FAI reports, but they're details that are mainly ignored in the actual findings and conclusions. So we're using this to consider ways suicide discourses are developed in the particular environment of prisons and how which discourses are emphasized and which are ignored. Just a bit of a disclaimer, in the last section of this presentation, we used direct quotes from the FAI reports. We've debated the ethics of using these quotes because the FAI reports are publicly available and they are not anonymized when they're released to the public. And some cases are very detailed. So we have pseudonymized the examples we use here, and we're focusing on ones that interrogate the FAI discourse that the prison system itself isn't at fault for individual suicides. So we felt it was important to present some of the language that's directly from those reports. So we are calling the analytical framework that we're working with suicidescapes, which centers spatial, affective, and discursive aspects of suicide and suicidality. From a spatial perspective, we're looking at how suicide is part of and impacted by social geographies, which are constituted by local, national, and international relations of power, and unequally distributed across different spatial locations, even within, let's say, the area of Scotland. For the sort of affective dimensions, we're looking at how emotions are embodied, felt, and expressed through social experience, but also how these are socially constructed by dominant discourses about suicide. And then this presentation in particular focuses on the discursive nature of suicide and how it's constructed in line with institutional and cultural assumptions, and how suicide is generally pathologized and individualized, which limits the scope for considering the impact of other factors, such as, in this case, the prison as a hostile environment, on suicidality. So we consider prisons as a suicidescape and a hostile environment. And so, as China Mills has said, hostile environments create conditions that make life for some unlivable and that incite, elicit, and invite suicidality. So in this slide, we talk about how previous studies and prison activists have long emphasized the hostility of prisons. This isn't really a new idea, and that they are specifically places designed to elicit human misery. So with regard to suicide specifically, some of the studies have found that suicide rates are a lot higher in prisons than they are in the general population. And particularly Scottish prisons have higher rates of suicide than English and Welsh prisons. So the FAIs that we're drawing on here are conducted after a suicide in custody, and they are inquisitorial rather than adversarial procedures. Basically, that means that these formal reports officially are not intended to explore or determine legal culpability, and the sheriffs who conduct them have no power to make findings of fault or to apportion blame against persons or organizations that might have contributed to the suicide. So this already limits the scope of this process to consider the role of prisons in the suicide and as hostile environments that invite suicidality. So our analysis has underscored that prison suicides are often sort of paradoxically deemed both unforeseeable and inevitable within the prison context. Various societal discourses about suicide are used to emphasize this and de-emphasize the context of prison. So these are some of the discourses that our analysis is demonstrating are used to justify the idea that the suicide is about the individual and not about prison. So mental illness is referenced in 33 of 37 reports that we included in our study, which are from 2016 to 2019. And they often are used to locate the cause of suicide in the individual, even if they don't have a diagnosed mental illness. Relationship breakdown and traumatic life history are also regularly raised as causes of suicides in prison. And one report that we're working with talks in great detail about a person's final phone call with his fiancée, in which their relationship ended. And this report constructs the suicide as entirely related to this breakup rather than any environmental factors, despite the same report also noting that the individual's presence in prison was a contributing factor to that breakup. Finally, drug and alcohol use is referenced in 26 of the 37 reports. And this includes the use of both prescription medication and illicit substances, and both are constructed as important indicators as to the causes of a suicide. One of the most common assumptions made about a suicide that involves substances is this idea that the person who died took too many of the wrong drugs, so illegal drugs or prescription drugs they weren't prescribed, and not enough of the right ones in pharmaceutical drugs designed to control their mental illness, whether or not they actually had a diagnosis and whether or not they consented to being prescribed prescription medication. So these discourses kind of locate suicide within the individual and de-emphasize the role of incarceration and the hostile prison environment in contributing to a person's experience of suicidality. In the second half of this presentation, Joe is going to present some alternatives to these discourses.
Thank you, Sarah. So yeah, given that we've established that the prison is quite keen in these FAIs to portray suicides as individually generated problems, we think that you can read into the FAIs and actually take quotes from the FAIs to show that the prison and the sheriffs are aware of the role of the prison environment in these deaths, but they're unwilling to actually acknowledge or do anything about that. So I'm going to present to you two kind of case studies who we're calling Mr. X and Mr. G to show how the prison environment can be read into these individualizing discourses. So the first example is Mr. X, and we can see from these quotes, and I'll just read them out in a second, we can see the ways that spatial and social segregation play a role in the negative impact on people's behavior and mental health. So this is a quote from the sheriff describing the lead up to this man's suicide. He was allowed little in the way of social interaction and spent up to 23 hours a day locked in his cell. He had limited access to exercise, was not allowed to participate in any of the educational activities, work parties, or recreation. His ability to contact family members by phone depended on the movement of other prisoners and was not guaranteed. And the strict regime and lack of facilities were features that had a significant negative impact on his mental health. He was imprisoned in circumstances which would have been tolerable for no more than a few days. So in this quote, we really see that the sheriff is very aware of the negative impact of the prison's policies on this individual, and yet still refers to it as a mental health issue. And the second quote sort of demonstrates this further. As an offence-protected prisoner, and that means kind of the crime that this man committed requires that he's protected from the mainstream prison population. And he was kind of, for this reason, for his own protection, he was not allowed to mix with the general prison population. However, the sheriff says, Prison C did not have the facilities to cater for prisoners on protection, and he was kept in solitary confinement for much of his remand. So here we see like a neglect, a lack of facilities, and the fact that he is of a certain status given his crime. The prison needs to have more facilities, needs to be prepared for these prisoners if they're going to keep them in this space. But because of that, they've created a situation where he's isolated, socially segregated, and unable to kind of participate in normal activities that would improve your mental health. So the next example is a man recalling this is continuing the story of Mr. X, essentially. So he was particularly afraid of being put in what was called the digger, which is solitary confinement. And he harbored some myths that this place was for, in quotes, nutters and killers. He'd been told that the nastiest people went in there, that you could hear people screaming through the walls, and that if you went in, you never came out. And while prisoners deemed at risk of suicide are who are subject to the Talk to Me, which is the suicide prevention program in Scotland, they're not sent to solitary confinement, although that isn't also true necessarily. They are sometimes sent to solitary confinement. It was clear that Mr. X lived in genuine fear of being put in the digger. These myths were never dispelled, and so he had good reason, as he saw it, to hide any suicidal feelings from the authorities. So in this example, in this quote, I think what you see is the way that myths, gossip, stories of the prison system, both within the population, within the staff, these things can have negative affects, create negative affects, create negative emotion on the part of prisoners. And the lack of clarity about what the Talk to Me suicide prevention procedure involves meant that Mr. X was actually unable to disclose his suicidality, which potentially led to or contributed towards causing his suicide. So in this example of Mr. G, we have a prisoner starting a petition to try and protest the treatment that he received prior to his death. And I'll just summarize this quote. So Mr. S, a different prisoner who knew Mr. G, drafted a petition among prisoners because he believed that death could have been avoided if Mr. G had been given the help that he deserved. 118 individuals signed it, although there may have been more who agreed with the sentiment. who apparently agreed that the treatment he received was unprofessional, unethical, and unacceptable, that he was subject to medical negligence and his tragic death could and should have been avoided. The mental health team and NHS staff had given a due care to his well-being and mental health. They considered this was not an isolated incident, and the petition referred to this being the third death of this nature in this prison in a few months. And there was, as well as being a few suicide attempts. So given that the FAIs tend to cast suicides as unforeseeable and inevitable, what we have here is a group of prisoners who believe that actually the opposite was the case, that it was foreseeable, that it was could have been prevented if he'd received the correct attention and treatment. And these some serious allegations in this petition. However, we've noticed that in the FAIs in general, prisoner testimony or prisoners' opinions about a suicide are only very occasionally elicited, and if they are, they're usually ignored. And in this FAI, despite this petition, no findings of recommendation, no recommendations of change to the system were made following this death, which just kind of shows that prisoners are not authorized knowers. They're not seen as legitimate sort of speakers within this system, despite potentially knowing the people who have died the best.
About 2 minutes.
Thank you, Jennifer. So to sum up, perfect timing. Essentially, the idea that the prison system's duty of care to support incarcerated people is kind of at odds with the concept of care, given that the entire prison system is designed around logics of incarceration, punishment, and control. So the hostile environment of the prison is actually, we suggest, potentially unable to prevent suicide, and in fact represents an environment in which suicide is inevitable, despite that being a problematic narrative within the FAIs. And even when it tries to care for, help people, it does tend to reproduce those logics of control. And for example, the FAI process itself, while it's supposed to get to the bottom of what happened, tends to be a process of absolution for the prison itself, pushing blame onto the individual and taking it away from the system, rendering suicides pathological through the 3 individualizing discourses that Sarah mentioned earlier on, which then again casts each suicide as inevitable and unforeseeable. But we suggest, and the argument in this paper is that you can read into the FAIs to see where the faults are in the system and what's sort of problematically being enforced and reproducing an environment in which suicide is more likely to happen. And if this prison does really care about reducing suicides, then it would approach this in a more thorough manner. And just to mention, there are a couple of limitations. The reports are only a representation of a sheriff's opinion. And so we suggest that more work is needed, maybe like a qualitative interview study with Scottish prisoners, sheriffs, prison staff, in order to really get to the bottom of what's happening here and how people are experiencing both suicidality in prison, but also the system's attempt to prevent suicide. And our final slide is just some references that we used for today, but thank you so much for listening, everyone. And we really welcome your comments and questions and thoughts on what we've got here. Thank you.
Thank you very much indeed, Sarah and Joe. Really well put together paper there. We have some time for questions. Would anyone like to venture one? Oliver.
Hi, thank you for that really dark but important paper. I was really interested by this sort of concept of the kind of illegitimacy of people in prison as knowers, kind of the delegitimization of their knowledge. I think that's such a powerful idea. I'm just wondering sort of what you think that can do for the way in which we study, write, and talk about these issues, sort of to think sort of other ways we can move beyond using the knowledge of people inside prison as sort of primary sources, and to think sort of alongside them, sort of think of like the sort of expansion of convict criminology and that sort of thing. Is that something that you've thought about, something that you're incorporating, just sort of interested in those ideas?
Sarah, shall I go? Do you want to?
Yeah, go for it, Joe.
Yeah, it's really interesting. We've just started looking at the potential of designing a participatory action research type design it involved kind of looking at suicide in Scotland, but potentially in prison as well. But I would recommend looking at Sarah Armstrong's work if you can on this, because I think she's really brilliant at getting at the way in which prisoners are conceptualized as less than human, and therefore not only are they supposed to be punished, but they shouldn't even be trusted to, which I think is a fairly common police versus citizen, guard versus prisoner attitude of kind of these people are enemies not to be trusted. And I think if we could somehow, there are good studies out there, obviously, of prisoners, the qualitative studies that have really raised up prisoners' voices and perspectives out with the guards kind of censoring, which is essentially what you get with these FAIs, is kind of a censored vision of the prison landscape. And even within that censored vision, you see some problematic behavior and ideas emerging. But yeah, it's a really interesting one that I'd love to explore more, and I think we will in future publications. But I don't know if Sarah, you had anything to add.
Yeah, I agree. Sarah Armstrong's work is a good place to start, but it's interesting because her work focuses on the families of people who've lost a loved one to suicide in prison. So even then, the access is really an issue. So like trying to get ethical approval to do research in prisons is made about as difficult as humanly possible. And that's partially supposedly for the protection of people in prisons, but I also think that there's a level of, we don't want people coming in here to do this work. So for my master's, the proposed project was going to be a study of folks who are incarcerated, but the ethics process would have taken at least a year. So they make it really difficult, but there are some really great first person studies done by people who, or theoretical work written by people who were incarcerated, who are now researchers. And so that's also a great place to start. But yeah, it would be amazing. But that's one of the reasons in this project, we really challenge the idea that these FAIs are the truth, because they're just one sheriff's opinion and they're not actually primary sources really in that way. So that's a great question. And we really wish we could be doing more at this time.
Great, thank you.
Thanks, Oliver. We're right on time, but if I can take the privilege, I just want to indulge us as a group for just a couple more minutes, just to be fair to our last set of speakers, to give them the same amount of time. Are there further questions for Joe and or Sarah? Because I do have one, but I realise I'm indulging myself. But hopefully it's useful for all, if I may. Very short question then. Hostile environment, at least to my understanding or my own scope of understanding and with the term, is perhaps also synonymous with or maybe emergent from phraseologies like hostile architecture. Or maybe it could be. And you talked about the impact of space and the impact of the prison in these narratives. But I wondered how much of this was impact of architecture or impact of regime and systems and mobilities and so on. I wondered if you could speak to any more examples where you saw this specific architecture or hostile architecture of the space having an impact upon the persons and their suicidability.
Should I start, Joe, and then pass over to you? Yeah, that's a really good point. And it is something, so we're currently writing two papers, one about the discourses, one about the hostile environment. And there is a big section in that paper about the sort of physicality of suicide prevention. So I think that there's something about the architecture of a prison in general and the ways in which you're constrained and constricted and solitary confinement. But there's also like the Scottish Prison Services Talk to Me policy, which is the suicide prevention policy, does allow the use of constraints, the use of special anti-ligature cells, the design of sort of special clothing that has no loose parts you can use and that is designed to not be able to rip. So there's like all these sort of physical elements that are also kind of vaguely mentioned usually in the FAIs when they want to say, look, we did everything we could kind of thing. There's surveillance and the camera. So we're kind of working through what we can access through these reports because there's not that much information about that, but that's absolutely part of it, is the ways in which we put people in a place that is both regime-wise and physically designed to make them want to die. And then we force them not to die using these sort of very physical, coercive techniques. So Joe, I don't know if you want to add to that a bit.
Not too much, but just like I think you've got it on you put it on, what's the phrase? you nailed it. Maybe that's the phrase I'm looking for. But it's like the whole way it's conceptualized. I love how you put it, Sarah. Is like, we don't want you to die, so we're going to force you not to die by like putting you in this separate area. It's just very bizarre. But I think architecture has a lot to do with it. And one thing I'd love to get hold of is like blueprints for prisons. Like, where are these people taken? What, how far away are they? What is the kind of regime that they're put under with guards and observations? I think we didn't really mention observations, but people can be, if they're on suicide risk watch, can be observed every 5 minutes, woken up every 5 minutes throughout the night in their solitary confinement cell. So it's just this very inhumane method of treating people who are in real distress. So great question, Jen, and I would love to explore it more. Thank you.
Thanks so much for the really great answer there as well. I'm going to bring the session to a close. It was such a fantastic set of papers which worked really well together. Again, thank you so much for being so timely with everything, because that meant that we actually did have time for questions. I really enjoyed myself. Thank you to everyone who's put the effort in for creating these wonderful presentations and for all the questions. I think we had a nice discussion here, which is a really nice way to finish our set of parallel sessions for this conference now. I think with 27 of them. So well done, everybody, if you've tuned into those. I will just draw your attention to our final conference event. I've put the link in the chat, which is our Explorations in Carceral Geography seminar, which begins in about 10 minutes. So that's why I'll end for here right now. Thanks so much again. I hope to engage with more of your work again in the future. Really, really appreciated learning a bit more about it, and hoping to see some more of this work out in press. So yeah, goodbye, and perhaps I see some of you in the next sessions. The Zoom room will stay open, so if you do have final interactions, you may use this time, but I shall say my goodbyes. Thanks, everyone.
Thanks, Jen.
Cheers. Bye-bye.